Well, it's that time of the year again, and I was wondering, what could I possibly make a review on that I recorded some footage for? Well, I guess Baldur's Gate has elves and family drama, so that counts as a Christmas game, right? It's been a while since I played pure D&D. I played 3.5 quite a bit in high school, I started 5th edition in college, and I got a bit bored of generic fantasy. I'm more of a sci-fi man, but I also played Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 in every possible way. Especially since I didn't have that many games because my parents were very much disliking video games. So let's see what Baldur's Gate 3 has to offer after years and years of early development. And an early release to avoid competition from Starfield, because that was really some scary competition. First things first, the reason why I'm only releasing the review now is because I have made multiple runs of the entire game. I think I have played through all of the content, but let's be completely clear. I'm not 100% sure because the game was clearly not finished. And even right now, Larian is still releasing new content, including ending scenes for your companions, but considering the last patch has managed to break some of my saves, I really don't want to make a 5th run, I believe, just to have all of the endings. Just like all of the other RPGs I reviewed, let's start with character creation. Obviously enough, this is a Dungeons & Dragons game, so you will have a character with a race, class, characteristic, feats, background and proficiencies, and they are all impacting each other in one way or another. For races, you have access to quite a few of them, though not the entirety of the roster. For example, you cannot create an Avariel, a Genasi, an Asimar, or really any of the races that you would find in the extra modules or extra books. What you have access to here is really only what you will find inside of the Player's Handbook of 5th edition. You still have a decent amount of races and classes to create some interesting builds, though for some reason multi-classing is deactivated in the easiest mode, for which I don't really see any reason to do that. But you don't have that many customization options. By that I mean you can obviously select eye colors, you can select your hair color, that sort of thing, and you have quite a few hairstyles to choose from. But for some godforsaken reason, in terms of facial shape, you only get a handful of presets, which is incredibly stupid because this game has a shitload of dialogue in which you actually see your character. What's even more infuriating about that is that Electronic Arts, on Dragon Age Inquisition, a game that went through an absolute hell of a development, had sliders and better options for customization. What's even more annoying is that the dev went on a rant during the early access period, complaining players were making too many human male fighter characters. Which is quite stupid considering this is literally the most played archetype in D&D. But you know, who cares about your AAA RPG having less face option than a free Korean MMO from the 2010s? That's what genitals are for, and you can choose more genitals than you have faces in this game. Genitals that will actually never be used in the game ever. At least I get to commit RPG blackface. Not digital knife here though, I actually have pointy ears. For characteristics, I'm not going to go through the meta of character creation. Role-playing channels already do it far better than I can, but to give you the base idea, your characteristics give you a bonus or malus every 2 points above or below 10 to associated skills, in which you can be proficient to increase that bonus or double it. Whenever a test happens, you get to use your raw characteristic bonus or one of your skill. You roll a 20-sided dice, apply modifiers, and observe the result. If like me you're a long-time player, you'll almost certainly notice there is a number of elements missing. Starting with one of my biggest pet peeves in modern D&D games, you cannot roll your characteristics, like in Neverwinter Nights 2 for example. Normally, in the paper RPG, you have the option of rolling 4d6, add the highest 3, giving you a number between 3 and 18, repeat 5 more times and enter the result in your characteristics. This can absolutely ruin your character at creation, especially if, like me, you have statistic-defying powers. But I will always remember my pen and paper character, Bertha, my naturally brain-damaged human barbarian, capable of losing at checkers against a clam, barely capable of talking in cogent sentences, but whose good nature got her to become a lord of the land just because nobody thought she had the IQ to understand how to be a tyrant. This time though, you only have the allocation system, in which you are given a set amount of points to assign, probably in the sacrosanct name of balance, and also because the writing is far below that of the 90s classic, like Fallout or Arcanum giving special option for very stupid characters in dialogues, but more on that later. So from that explanation, you might understand that you want to have only even numbers in order to min-max your character. However, For some godforsaken reason, again, the pre-made characters do not follow that rule. Instead, they have a bunch of odd numbers everywhere, which means they are not going to be as effective as they should be for their class. Since initial launch, it has been somewhat corrected because now you have access to a magic mirror inside of the camp that allows you to completely respect characters, including the pre-made ones. What really disappoints me regarding characters, though, is the amount of cut content from the core books. If you have played the Pathfinder games, and in real life it's actually an offshoot of D&D, you know there is an enormous amount of content that was lifted verbatim from the player's manual, and there is really an infinity of builds that you can make in these games. Here though, there is a ton of stuff missing. For example, wizards don't have access to the entire spell roster, and in the case of some subclasses like Thief, for example, because you do not have all of the content available to you, you are not as effective in combat as you should be. And the big problem is, this game is mostly combat. While I'm on that, combat is obviously going to be a big part of the game, but it has not been particularly well balanced. It is not nearly as bad as Divinity Original Sin 2, where, the enemies was changing the type of terrain all the goddamn time, and it was a chore essentially to switch it back to something that was more agreeable to your character. But this time, Larian has decided to go for massively outnumbering the player. As you probably know, your party is made of 4 characters, and you will often be fighting 3 or 4 to 1. And this situation can be made way worse. Frequently, when you are fighting a boss or a mini-boss in the encounter, you're going to end up talking to him beforehand, or at least you have the option. This means that if you just went to him and talked to him with your entire party group together, you end up in a situation where you are not only in a bad position in terms of terrain, but you're also completely surrounded. Which made me adopt the foolproof strategy of the big kaboom.
Kaboom?
Yes, Rico. Kaboom.
And sadly, despite the game throwing a ton of enemies at you at all time, Larian didn't refactor the engine at all, meaning that instead of having smaller groups acting together, or at least moving together, every single opponent has his place in a turn order and will not do anything outside of his turn order. Meaning each turn can take an absolute eternity to finish, especially when the AI craps out and needs a solid 10 seconds to make up its mind. In Original Sins 2 it was not as much of a problem, but Larian decided to be lazy and not refactor anything. They did not even include an option to speed up the combat. But in my opinion, the biggest sin of this game is to not give you any power over the camera elevation. If you are completely zoomed out, your camera is essentially going to be following your characters at a set altitude, which is a pretty big problem because on occasion, enemies will be at a higher elevation than you, and you need to fight with the camera, rotating it in every possible direction in order to see the target. And even then, you will frequently be only able to see just a foot or something of that sort, which means you don't actually know that much about the enemy you're trying to target without opening the info screen. Meaning that if the camera has not been configured to show a certain area where enemies are peppering you from, you'll get more seasoning than a bad Cajun shrimp until you find a way to reach that area. Outside of the fighting though, I'm quite satisfied with the amount of effort Larian has done for using your character's social skills. Obviously you're gonna have the opportunity to talk to a lot of different characters, including some of your enemies, and you'll have a lot of options to persuade, intimidate, coerce them, or just get them to do anything without any kind of skill checks, depending on how you actually interact with them. For example, during Act 2, there is a mini-boss and his minion that you can get to commit suicide instead of actually fighting them. You also have a number of puzzles that you can solve, however I found that frequently the best option is to either use invisibility or Misty Step, aka the teleport, in order to just ignore the puzzle entirely. Another issue I encountered a lot, especially during my initial run, is a tendency for the quest triggers to break. For example, in Act 3, I was wandering looking what the next step of the main quest was supposed to be, running around the city like a madman trying to find what the fuck I was supposed to do, only to realize that I had sequence break the main quest. So I had to load a save 10 hours back because the sequence in which I had accomplished certain tasks and getting in certain areas had broken the game. Even after fixing that issue, one of the main bosses got so confused, he exited his room where I could easily kill him out of range from his minion and traps. My last annoyance is on the level cap. Your characters are limited to level 12, even though there is more than enough XP, at least on a good run, to reach level 14 or 16. I could be wrong, but I think this is deliberately done in order to leave some space from DLC and other content. That being said, I don't see the point in it, because if you look at, say, Neverwinter Nights 2, you could not only go to level 20 or even higher than that if you played the expansion, and you had all of the prestige classes. And there is nothing like that in this game. So why exactly are we limited to only that? My answer is probably because the game was released not finished. At least alignments are not a thing. I absolutely hate that mechanic. Obviously, there are some other limitations, due to this being a video game compared to pen and paper, such as fudging dice, or as I always do as a GM, rewarding a successful sneak attack with an automatic death for the rogue player, especially when they play on a non-combat oriented subclass like Thief. Here though, the game applies damage as is, and attacking from stealth will regularly cause some issues as the game has different game modes, real time and turn by turn. Sounds fine at first until you realize that you can actually have some characters and enemies get into a turn by turn, which happens automatically when combat occurs, and the rest is still in real time, creating a little bit of confusion as you desperately try to do what you intended with your other characters. And no, switching them all to turn by turn before engaging the enemy does not help, because the game will then run multiple turn-based groups separately. On the audio front, it's a little bit of a mixed bag for me. The voice acting is good, it's sometimes very good, though I question the direction of some characters. For example, Astarion is very grating to me, so much that I relegated him to the camp 99% of the game. But I don't think it's a fault of the voice actor, I think it's how the character was written and how he was directed. I've listened to some of his other work and he is nowhere near as irritating to me. Then you have some villains, like Catherine Thorm or Auntie Ethel, who are completely and utterly stealing the show anytime they are present, which makes me really sad that they are not appearing more. Interestingly enough, your character is also mute for most of the game, at least if you created your own or selected the Dark Urge as a starting story. You might think that the character is mute because there is so much text in the game, however I don't think that's really the case, because not only is your character speaking quite a bit when there is some banter on the map when you are traveling, but just like Mass Effect, whenever you are talking to anyone, it is fully voiced by the other characters. So I'm not actually sure why your main character does not speak, especially considering this is a AAA game with AAA budget and also some early access sales. So unlike games like Rogue Trader, the Pathfinder games or Pillars of Eternity, there's not really a budget limitation to justify not having a voiced character. Especially when you consider he is actually talking on occasion, so there is no such thing as placing yourself in the boot of the main character. The music, with a few exceptions, is very generic, and having God knows how many renditions of Down by the River started being downright irritating to me. No matter where you are in the game, the music simply cannot hold a candle to Baldur's Gate 2. It cannot. There is only a single music that somewhat marked me, the one where you're fighting Raphael in the House of Hope, in no small part because it is so different from the other ones, but because he is the final boss of this section, this means you're going to be fighting him for multiple minutes, which means the music is going to loop quite a few times and become quite annoying. So there's really no music in this entire game I remember fondly, like the theme of Metal Gear, the ambient choirs of Bloodborne, the orchestrals of Ace Combat, or hell, the Millicent battle at the very end of Baldur's Gate 2. Visually, the game is fairly uneven, which I suspect is due to the engine limitations. There is quite a lot of texture pop-in and the shadows are rendered a little bit strangely. To be fair, I think it might be due to my AMD rig because I've seen videos from other players and I don't really see these weird grainy shadows that I have. But the biggest issue for me is the quality of the textures themselves. I'm a big proponent of style over chasing the golden pixels, but it's like Larian could not really make up their mind. The skin texture are damn pretty, which is good considering how much close-up dialogue there is, but then the clothing, armors and weapons often look primitive with flat textures in lieu of actual geometry, and in many cases there's not even any texture map to make them pop out a little bit more. On some pieces, it's extremely jarring as there are strings and laces or knots on the armor, but instead of modeling them and applying some flow simulation to them, like Shadowheart's hair for example, they just decided to just draw them as a flat texture and in very low resolution. The lip sync and facial animation are also pretty bored. They often seem to be at odds with the tone of the scene or the lines themselves, and to be randomly switching or getting frozen. I haven't searched the detail, but I think most of the lines were recorded separately from facial mocap. So outside of certain key scenes, we end up with repeated facial expressions that don't match the nuance of the conversation. Another issue I have is with the flow simulation. It was clearly not finished and it constantly freaks out, creating all manners of clipping with fabric or hair. As soon as you have any kind of tunic or for example some of the druid garments, it's very visible. It's to the point that I think the only flow simulation that they really debugged was Shadowheart's ponytail. Even then, it seems they completely forgot about the metal decoration in her hair and they forgot about the weight. Reflections are also fucked, often appearing as flat surface or having the map display as a solid object clipping through armor. Seriously, Neverwinter Nights 2 didn't fuck that up so bad, and it was made 20 years ago. In terms of environment, it's a little bit difficult for me to judge because, let's be completely honest, this is Dungeons and Dragons. It has defined fantasy for decades and decades now. Which is probably why I'm getting a fantasy indigestion. So the question is, can we really identify this as being Dungeons and Dragons or Baldur's Gate? Well, it's a little bit of a 50-50. In the very first act, I would have to say no. There is nothing that really jumps out as being D&D or Baldur's Gate, beside an owlbear cave. As soon as you reach the second act, it gets a little bit better. For example, you can go through the Underdark, which obviously is going to be filled with mushrooms and a bunch of dangerous creatures, which is very much D&D and you can actually identify as such. The fact that you're going to be encountering a Shar temple and you're going to be also encountering some Duergar, which are the evil dwarves of D&D, as well as some deep gnomes. You don't know how many times I had to redo this take. When you go back up to the surface though, it's once again going to be very generic and not really identifiable. The main area is a castle, city and a little bit of a forest covered by a dark fog, which honestly I thought was the same curse of the Shadow King as in Neverwinter Nights 2. I did not think it was something specific to Baldur's Gate. This area is completely generic and could have been in any other fantasy game, to be completely honest. As part of the main quest, you will also have to go through a Sharon Temple and a Mindflayer Nest, which are doing a decent job at making you know this is Dungeons and Dragons and D&D. However, this is more or less the last time this is going to happen, because during Act 3, when you are finally in Baldur's Gate, there is a few little elements here and there, but overall this is generic fantasy city. The only two things actually that let me know this was Baldur's Gate was Sorcerer's Sundries, like the name implies it is a sorcerer's shop, and the Temple of Baals deep under the sewers. That was it. During the final act, which is essentially the final battle, you will be fighting in a ruined version of Baldur's Gate, and the only thing that really tells you it is Baldur's Gate is the presence of mind flayers everywhere. During this final act, you will also be seeing quite a bit of Baldur's Gate in the background. However, you will notice that the models and the textures are really bad for distance object. I mean 2010s levels of bad. It's particularly grating because when you look at games like for example Pillars of Eternity 2, you can not only tell exactly which game it is, but you can also tell which region it is if you have played the game. By opposition, Baldur's Gate 3 seems a bit soulless to me. But otherwise, the game is running relatively smoothly. It was well over 100 FPS maxed out in most areas playing in 2K. That being said, at least when the game initially launched, the performance was going down and down and down, making me think that there was a memory leak and I had to close the game and restart it in order to fix that. So depending on what machine you are using, the optimization might not be the absolute best. Just a little break to remind you that if you want to continue seeing my autism, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, leave a like or dislike, and leave a comment because the algorithm gods apparently like it a lot. Thank you! Now onto the video. So, onto the most important part, the writing. And Larian has giant boots to fill in this case, especially considering Shadow of Amn, the expansion to Baldur's Gate 2, and I think the original game as well personally, is widely regarded as a masterpiece when it comes to writing. and they didn't roll a 1, but it's clearly not up to that high standard. By that, I mean the writing is a bit all over the place, probably from having multiple writers. Some quests and characters are extremely well written, while others are boring to the point of putting me in a coma. And sometimes some NPC make choices so unfathomably stupid or contradictory to everything they've done so far, I wanted to drop the game. I kinda compare this game to The Mandalorian show. Started not perfect, but promising enough, then added a ton of superfluous cameo and degenerated into quite bad writing. Lucky enough, we are not diving into level 3 levels of trash. Had it been a Call of Duty or if Larian had been a complete newcomer to RPGs, I'd have been more tolerant, but not if it's a follow-up to one of the best CRPGs of all time. But the details go behind the spoiler wall, so if you don't want to know more, go to here. Okay, so let's start a character creation. While you can select one of the characters that are already pre-generated, like Shadowheart, Astarion, etc., it is very obvious that you are supposed to use the Dark Urge story, the only one that does not exist as an NPC companion. If you do a full custom, there is no story interaction whatsoever related to your background in the game. It will just be a way to generate rerolls, and if you select one of the pre-generated, you also won't have access to some of the major plot points, though mostly in Act 3. The Dark Urge in and of itself is not actually anything original, it just means that you are yet another spawn of Baal, the god of murder, that was killed at the end of Baldur's Gate 2. What it really means is that your character has a drive to be the biggest, most psychopathic murder hobo in the history of all the Forgotten Realms. At least that's what the game tells you, but it only manifests a few times during the entire game. First slaughtering an innocent bard girl, then potentially your love interest if you have not killed a Saloon cleric, and even that is not actually mandatory, you can actually resist the urge throughout the entire thing. If you do decide to indulge in your urges, however, which the game really encourages you to do through its narration, almost every single time you're gonna get punished in one way or another. By this I mean you might be receiving an object or a power which is not necessarily that good, for example turning into an avatar of Baal called a Slayer, essentially a big four-armed monster. But your companions might also leave you, attack you, or you might not get access to them at all. For example, early in the game, you encounter the Sorcerer Gale, who is stuck in a fast travel rune and sticks out his arm, asking for help. You can literally rip his hand off, which also doesn't have the scream normally associated with getting your limb chopped off, while your other companions just watch and make no comment until the deed is done, and make Gale disappear from the game entirely. This is going to be a recurring problem, especially in Act 2 in the Shadowlands, where killing the cleric to please Baal and be able to turn into a Slayer will fail a lot of quests, forcing you to play under level, but also making your life considerably more difficult against the first boss of Act 2. Obviously you can compensate by playing into a easier game mode, however it's pretty damn clear that while the narration was pretty well written to encourage you to play as an evil character, it is not supported by the rest of the game. As you continue, you eventually reach the Temple of Baal in Act 3, who's supposed to be dead after the events of Baldur's Gate 2, but don't worry too much about it, they keep coming back up, to either become his chosen and be the ultimate murder hobo, or follow the path of virtue and reject your inheritance. Becoming his chosen being the most boring choice, sadly. Whoever wrote this arc does not really know how to write evil characters. And ironically I did not realize it before I wrote the script, but this isn't really the D&D Mandalorian. Your character is literally Revan from Knights of the Old Republic. Regarding the companion quests, just from the volume each character gets, it's very clear Larian spent most of the effort on Shadowheart, who not only gets the most screen time, but most importantly has her companion quest directly associated to the main quest. By this I mean during the Act 2 you are supposed to reach an artifact called the Night Song, which turns out to be an Aasimar, and one of the main plot points of her companion quest is whether she decides to kill the Aasimar or not. If she does kill her, then she will become a Dark Justiciar and fully devoted to her goddess Shar. If she does not, she essentially switches to be a Saloon cleric, even though she should have lost all of her spells, have her hair turn white, and also becomes the best waifu in the game. as an aside, because apparently some tourists were surprised by that, she is around 40 in the game, which is not exactly surprising because if you read the core book, should I say a full-blooded elf will live about 750 years, and a half-elf reaches maturity around 40, so it's completely normal for her to look as young as she is. The second place is clearly Astarion for volume of content, while almost everything about him is played during Act 3. There is not really anything special happening in any of the other acts. And while Larian has been adding some more content for the other characters, it's pretty damn clear that they don't really have anything really compared to the other two. The difference is so stark that I'm seriously wondering if they didn't started running out of budget. Because while they started working obviously long before the early access started on October 2020, they clearly released the game early to avoid competition from Starfield in an unfinished state, and they are still adding some stuff to it. One thing I absolutely hated in Dragon Age 2 is sadly also present in Baldur's Gate 3. All of your companions are player sexual, meaning they have zero preference regarding the romantic interest, which is already insane when you just consider basic logic, especially when characters like Minthara are raging race supremacists, but Gale has literally screwed the goddess of magic. Just why, in all that is fucked, would he consider jumping my bone, or even worse, get into cringe bear sex with the most boring druid of all time? More disturbingly, every single companion wants to get busy without any advance from your character. Just being even remotely decent, at least whatever they consider decent, will trigger a cringe scene. Even from a Mind Flayer NPC, a race that literally reproduces asexually. They do not have the gear. If fucking EA understood how much they fucked up 10 years ago, enough that they never did it again, Larian has no excuse to do it. Anyway, that's enough about companions, so let's talk a little bit about the main quest, or a little summary of it. To put it simply, what's happening here, like in many D&D campaigns, is that 3 Chucklefox are trying to control the world once again. And how do they do it? Well, they are trying to control an Elder Brain, a giant mass of neurons mixed with a hentai tentacle monster, with a magical artifact subduing it, because, you know, that kind of idea has never gone around before, hasn't it? So you start the game by being infested with a tadpole supposed to turn people into Mind Flayer within a week, and Mind Flayers are the slaves of the Elder Brain essentially. But because it would be a little bit inconvenient for the game for you to turn into a Mind Flayer immediately, obviously your tadpole is a little bit special. During the late phases of the early access the symptoms had started to show, but the full release has rewrote a lot of things. So, after you escape, you will meet a number of your companions, also infested, and discovering the tadpoles give you powers that can be further enhanced by absorbing more of them. Which makes absolutely no sense considering the lore of Mind Flayer, but don't mention that. Doing so causes disgust in the other characters, but there is no other effect on the endings or actually in your relationship with them, so you can go wild if you want. So, as the game continues, you discover the plan of the aforementioned Chucklefox to seize power by infesting the leadership and rule the world for their deities, in a universe where even bigger Chucklefox, like your party, regularly kills gods. But you know what could possibly go wrong. Oh, and if you have selected the Dark Urge as a character, you were one of the original Chucklefox who got usurped by the doppelganger chick. The only reason your characters still have a mind of their own, instead of being controlled by the Absolute, the Elder Brain, is because of the artifact Shadowheart carries, inhabited by another being which will turn out to be a rogue Mind Flayer. So you travel through the land after the Nautiloid ship you were on crashes, either going through the badly written evil route by killing everybody in the Druid Grove, or killing the leadership of the goblins, causing them to disperse and leaving the grove untouched. Regardless of your choice, you will go to a land covered in a dark fog, which, like I said before, reminds me a lot of the Dark Curse from Neverwinter Nights 2. And actually does exactly the same fucking thing, so no point for originality here. In this land, you will infiltrate Moonrise Tower, where the first chosen, Ketheric Thorm, is residing. Allegedly, an undead risen elf which looks very little like an elf and revering the god Merkul, the god of death. And it's really a shame that he's the first one you encounter and have to kill, because he is by very far the most interesting of the 3 and the most intimidating. Orin, the doppelganger chick and chosen of Baal, is essentially just a psychotic murder hobo that has nothing interesting going for her, besides trying to be a cliché of the crazy chick. And finally you have Gortash, the chosen of Bane, god of tyranny, who does not even have the murder part, he just looks like a hobo. Anyway, once you have killed your first chosen, you get your first nether stone. The thing is used to control the Elder Brain, or at least the artifact keeping it under control, in theory. So now, you know you need all 3 stones to attempt to control the real big bad and get to Baldur's Gate. Where it gets clear pretty damn quick, the city is under enemy control. So you wander through the city, solving murders, meeting Auntie Ethel again, the best villain in the entire game, quite frankly, being a pain in the ass of the other 2 Chuckle Fox, dealing with the mechas of one of them, which turns out to be inhabited by Rendo's brains, pretty much the premise of Alita Battle Angel, and the Baal cult on the other end in a sewer. Which brings me to one of the more Mandalorian-esque aspects of the game. We get the return of a few characters from Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, including Jaheira, Minsk, and Viconia de Vir, appearing in Acts 2 and 3, the first 2 being able to join you. Now, obviously the actors have changed, it's been over 20 years after all, but it's very clear that an effort was made to stick to the original spirit. For example, the demeanor of both Minsk and Jaheira has remained fairly intact, but they didn't have that much character development in Baldur's Gate 2 to begin with. Sadly, Viconia got absolutely butchered, which is a massive shame because she was by very far the favorite of most people, including myself. To give you the rundown if you have never played the other games, she was a priestess of the Draw evil goddess who refused to sacrifice her brother in a ritual. For that, he got turned into a half-spider monstrosity, one of which you can actually see in Act 2, while allowing her to escape to the surface. Through the Baldur's Gate 2 campaign, she goes through quite a lot of soul-searching and guilt over her past actions, eventually going through an alignment change from evil to neutral if you romance her. Here instead, she turns into a cartoonishly evil cult leader for another cult which feels really out of character to me. And yes, I'm aware the non-romance ending for her was joining a Sharon cult before destroying it, but it feels like lazy writing to just shove a cameo of a fan-favorite character. And that's my main issue with the return. The new companions are way more generic, with a few notable scenes, like Karlach breakdown upon the Tyrant Chucklefuck death, which did pull at some of my very cynical heartstrings, which really only reminds me how much better the previous game was in terms of character writing. At least for Minsk, I still couldn't care less about Jaheira. Anyway, once you got all 3 stones, you eventually go to confront the Elder Brain, which miserably fails, as it has now absorbed some magic from the artifact used to control it, in order to evolve into a Nether Brain. At least it didn't get its tentacle on a water stone, I'm not sure I can handle that level of hentai. Turns out, you failed to dominate the brain because of its evolution and not being a mind flayer yourself. So you are giving the usual pick your ending scene choices in a few layers. First, you have either giving the stone to the shady Illithid who was inside of the artifact all along, you can turn yourself or one of your companions into a mind flayer, or you can help the Githyanki prince that was trapped in the artifact as well. If you were to choose to help the prince or get on his side, it will cause the Emperor, the rogue Illithid that was helping you all along, who also took refuge in the artifact to avoid getting enslaved by the Elder Brain, to join the Elder Brain again, because that makes fucking sense. Once you've made your choice, the final battle begins, which entails going through the city, killing way too many groups of hostiles on your way, and potentially summoning some allies based on your choices during the previous quests. A feature I actually didn't use much because for one I had not realized until the last boss that I had it, and also because these battles were way too long already, so I did not want to add anything to the turn order. When you finally reach the Elder Brain, you have two choices. Gale can either blow himself up on the Elder Brain, which is not technically a bad ending but technically not the good one either, or you can climb the spine of the Elder Brain to fight on top of it. First to open some kind of portal to its consciousness, then to actually try and subjugate it. At this point you get the very last choice for your ending, in which you will either dominate it and become some kind of a supreme ruler until another Chucklefox beats you down, or you can actually destroy it, which gives you the actual good ending, in which you get some dialogue permutation from your companion depending on if you completed their quests or not. So the game suffers from what I call the Bethesda syndrome, meaning it's an RPG that promises you many endings, I think Larian pretended there were 7,000 of them, just because they have some minor permutation at the very end, brought to you as a consequence of your choices trademark. But in reality, your choices, besides extremely obvious triggers, have zero effect on the ending, none of them particularly marking and offering no insight into the fate of the characters after the end credits. In comparison, If you look at the good ending of Baldur's Gate 2 with Romance Viconia, for example, my personal favorite, the son of Baal rises to influential position and remains with Viconia, who eventually gives him a son. She is eventually assassinated by a drow assassin, causing the player avatar to go on a crusade against the Dark Elves. Now granted, this ending got some players, including myself, unhappy enough a mod was made to change the ending for both the PC and Viconia, essentially cornering the Lost Cult into leaving them alone. This time around, they have a daughter who becomes a famous adventurer herself. That was my headcanon at least, and I really wish Larian had made some kind of save importer to reflect what had happened in the previous games. Even Electronic Arts made an importer of sort for the Dragon Age 3, so why did you not do that, Larian? So now I have to come to somewhat of a conclusion, and to me it seems that the game is not really targeted towards old D&D player like myself who wanted a proper follow-up to Baldur's Gate 2. What Larian made is more of a baby's first CRPG, I think, and cut a lot of content from the base 5e to accommodate that. To me, it feels somewhat similar to Dragon Age Origins, but the EA product has, I think, more soul than this game. The Larian one lives in the shadow not only of the previous title, but also of Divinity Original Sin, and considering this is a game that requires you to invest a lot of time into it, I think each campaign is 50 to 75 hours, give or take, it's not really a game that I see myself finishing over and over again like, say, Mass Effect, because this is a CRPG, and if you want something that has some complexity, it's clearly not the product for you. I think a much better choice would be Pillars of Eternity if you wanted something like that. Now, I'm fully aware that it just won the Game of the Year award. That being said, it has pretty much no competition. Starfield is dead in the water, and there has been no other CRPG released this year. Well, actually there is Rogue Trader, but that came out too late. So if you want a fairly classic CRPG that does not require you to min-max that much, or if you just want to dip your toe in the pond, so to speak, I think this is a decent enough choice. And if this is your first entry in the series, a lot of the bad points that I have mentioned probably won't impact you too much. Once you're done with it, I would just really encourage you to go play Baldur's Gate 2 at least, and its expansion Shadow of Amn. Baldur's Gate 1 is a little bit too janky even for me. Anyway, hope you have enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one. Salut, bonsoir!